It was 21 years ago that God called me into the ministry and asked me to become a minister of the gospel. And so it was actually 21 years ago that I gave my very first sermon ever right here in this church on this platform. So this is kind of a little bit of a coming home for me today. So I just say thank you. It's good to be back today. Have you ever noticed, here's a question for you this morning, you ever noticed in the Bible that God always when God talks about us, He always calls us His children. We're always referred to as the children of God. And it doesn't make any difference what translation of the Bible you read, whether it's the King James, the New King James, NIV, and all the other translations that are out there, God always calls us His children. And nowhere in the Bible will you ever find where God says, excuse me, God will call us like the adolescents of God, or we're referred to as the teenagers of God, or the middle-aged people, or these are my senior citizens. No, we never see that, do we? God always refers to us as His children. And whether you're 5 years old or you're 100 years old, you're considered to be a child of God. And I believe that there's a reason that God says that, and there's a reason why God refers to us that way. So today I want to take a look at a story in the Bible that we read earlier on faith. And there's many, many great stories of faith in the Bible. We know about Abraham or Moses or Noah, or the story of Daniel when he was in the lion's den. And there's a lot of great, great stories of faith in the Bible. But what we read today, I believe, for me, is probably one of the greatest stories of faith that there is in the Bible. And I'll explain that to you here as we go. As we read in the story today, the disciples and Jesus, they went and they got to this place, and there were all these people there. And so Jesus gets up and he starts teaching the people. And it says he's preaching and teaching, and it's just a great day. The sun is shining, it's a blue sky. There's thousands of people there, and the day is just going so great. And so Jesus is up there and he's preaching and he's teaching, and it's like going so good, he just doesn't want to stop. It's like he's got a 4-part sermon series he wants to give, and he just decided rather than spread it out over 4 Sundays, I'm going to get it all done in one day. And so he's up there and he's just preaching and he's teaching the people, and pretty soon it's noon, and then it gets to be the afternoon, and the next thing we read that it's starting to get towards supper time. So then it says the disciples, they got to a point where they were talking, maybe this is enough for one day. And so they go over to Jesus and they said, Lord, it's been a great day today. What a service we've had. Great preaching and teaching, and oh man, the people are here, and this has been great today. But it's getting kind of late, and so I think maybe, you better just shut her off, and we need to send the people home. Send the people out and to another town so they can get something to eat, because it's about supper time, and they're getting hungry, and we need to, send them off to get something to eat. But you see, Jesus kind of knew their heart. Because when we read a little bit earlier in that story, it said that because they got there and things were so busy that they didn't even get a chance to eat themselves. So personally, I believe that the disciples weren't really so worried about the crowd as they were themselves. It was their own stomach that was grumbling and that was hungry. But, they weren't going to go up to Jesus and just say, well, hey, we're hungry, so let's knock it off, let's get out of here. So they go by the guys, they're concerned for the people. And so they get up there, and again, they say to Jesus, we got to send the people away. They're getting hungry. It's late in the day. But because Jesus knew their heart, and he kind of knew what was going on, he just kind of looked at them, and he said, oh, you're worried about the people? And oh, yes, Lord. Yep, it's the people. Yep, this is late in the day. They're getting hungry. We should send them off. Oh, you're really concerned about the people? Oh, yes, Lord, it's all about the people. So Jesus just simply looked at them and said, well, then you give them something to eat. He said, I'll just keep on preaching, and you're that concerned with the people, then, hey, go ahead, you just give them something to eat. And sometimes when I think about things, when I read stories in the Bible, I like to put myself, sometimes I'm there and I'm watching. And in my mind, I can see in that moment when he told the disciples to just give them something to eat, I believe what I always consider they kind of had an Abbott and Costello moment. And if you're old enough to remember Abbott and Costello, when things got going, I think the disciples stood there too, and they were like, well, what? Give them something to eat. And so they get back together and they're like, I think Jesus has been in the sun too long. You see the thousands of people are here, and he wants us to feed these people and give them something to eat. It's like, I don't think he's thinking quite straight right now. So they go back to Jesus and they said, really, Lord, in order for us to feed these people here today, it would take a half a year's wages. They said, for us to go out and buy food for all these people, it would take a half a year's wages to come and feed these people today. And so Jesus just told him, he said, well, then just go see what you can find and we'll go from there. You see, Jesus knew that it was about them and it wasn't about the people, because the people were still there. None of the people were complaining. I mean, he'd been preaching for 6 hours, 8 hours, and the people are still there and they're receiving from him and they're listening to what he's got to say. And, they're not complaining. They're not getting up and leaving. And the bottom line is, on any kind of service, and just like here today, if I stood up here and I just keep going and I keep going and I keep going, sooner or later you're going to reach the point where you go, you know what, I've had enough for today, and you're going to get up and you're going to leave. Well, nobody was doing that. See, everybody was still there, and they were just right into it, listening to Jesus, listening to the Word. And so Jesus knew that it wasn't the people who were complaining, and he knew it was the disciples. So again, like I said, that's why I think he tested them and said, well, then just give them something to eat. So they come back to Jesus, and he said, okay, well, go find and see what you can find, and then we'll go from there. And so he goes back to preaching and teaching the Word, and the disciples left, and pretty soon in this version of the story, it says they came back and they said, all right, Lord, here's the deal. We've looked around, we found 5 fish, 2 loaves of bread, that's it. That's all we found, and I think we all know that that's not going to be enough to feed all these people. So they said, you need to cut her off, let's just all call it a day. Great service, but let's end it and call it a day. The thing is, when you read stories in the Bible, what's kind of neat is that, especially in the Gospels, a lot of those stories are told in 1 or 2, 3 or 4, all 4 versions of the Gospel. So it's kind of neat when you read this, to go and read the story in all the Gospels, because every Gospel writer kind of got a little different slant than what was going on that day, and a little bit of different story. And so when you look at some of the other Gospels, you'll find out that there's a little extra information given in these. So the disciples came back, and they said to Jesus, we found 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. But when you look at the story in the gospel, I believe it's the Gospel of John, John is actually saying that Andrew comes up and he says to Jesus, we found a little boy, and he's got 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. And it's estimated in time and studying and all this and that, they estimated that the boy was probably maybe 10 years old. Is kind of what they figure. So anyway, Andrew goes to Jesus and he said, well, we found a little boy, and he's got like 5 loaves of bread, 2 fish. That's all we found, so there you go. But again, if you keep reading this, and this is the thing here today, I don't believe that they found the little boy. They didn't find him. I believe he found the disciples. Because as I think about this and as I read the story, this is Jesus, who we know loves us. And Jesus was a man of compassion. And so he's there with all these people, and it says, there was like 5,000 people that day. In essay, they're saying 5,000 men. And in the Bible time, they only counted the men. So if you add wives and children, that they estimated the crowd that day could probably have been over 10,000 people. And so Jesus is a man full of compassion. And so as he's standing there that day, I think to myself, I just think there's got to be more. Because a man of compassion, we read throughout this whole Bible over and over, and Jesus performing miracles and healing the sick and raising the dead. And I can just see Jesus as he's standing there preaching, and I just feel like there's more. But the thing is, I don't have to go off my own thoughts. Because when you look at the same story in some of the other Gospels, in the Gospel of Luke, it says that he welcomed them and spoke to them about the kingdom of God and healed those who needed healing. And that's also backed up in the Gospel of Matthew when it says when Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them and healed their sick. So now we know that Jesus is not only standing there preaching and teaching that day, but he was also healing people, and I think that's just the way Jesus operated. And I could see him standing there, giving the word, blessed are those and meek in the word, and blessed, and he's talking about the kingdom of heaven. And oh, look at this, there's a guy here with a broken leg, and son, here, be healed today, and they're healed and they're up. And then pretty soon he's talking and he's walking around and he's teaching the people, and there's somebody over there with a shriveled hand, and he'll go over there, because that's the way Jesus was. Jesus was filled with compassion. He's not going to overlook sickness, and when he sees people with a need, he's going to meet that need. And so I believe that's what he was doing that day. So here's what I think really happened in this story. I think this 10-year-old boy was sitting right on the front row. And he was sitting there that day, and he's not only hearing and listening to Jesus as he's preaching and he's teaching, but he's also watching. And he's watching Jesus heal people. And he's sitting there, and Jesus, oh, look at that, Jesus just healed that person. Oh, look at that person had a cough, and Jesus healed him. And so now Jesus is teaching the little boy. He's taking it in, and he's watching. Oh, look at Jesus just went over there now, and he healed that person. And he's taking all this in that day. Now keep in mind, he's seeing the exact same things that the disciples were seeing. But the disciples were caught up in the things of the world. And maybe because they've traveled with Jesus so often, they've been with him so long that these things are becoming second nature to them. But they're just, they're not, yeah, whatever, so Jesus is healing people, that's cool. But you know what, I'm hungry and that's more important right now. But not to this little boy. And so what I think happened is that as the disciples went over to Jesus and said, we need to send everybody home and call it a day, and Jesus said, you know what, you go, you feed them. Find something to see what you can find, and then we'll go from there. And I think as the disciples were together in a group and they're talking like, Jesus is like, he's got to be crazy. He's been in the sun too long today because he wants us to find, where are we going to find food here, and how are we going to feed these people, and so on and so forth. And I think this little boy was sitting there and he was listening to the disciples, and he heard their story. He heard them discussing and talking things between them. And so I think what he did is he got up, and because he thought, man, I've seen the miracles that Jesus has been performing today, and I've seen him healing the sick and doing all these mighty things, and there's nothing that Jesus can't do. So I think he got up and he went up to the people, he went to the disciples, and he said, hey man, hey guys, look at here. I got five fish and 2 loaves of bread. And in that moment, I think the disciples' first reaction, they probably looked at him and went, what? Get out of here, kid. Get away. It's like, are you really? 5 loaves? Do you see the crowd? Do you see how many people are here today? And you got 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish? Like, what are we supposed to do with that? And they probably told that kid, they said, go on. You quit bothering us. We got enough things to worry about. We're trying to appease Jesus right now and figure out how we're going to get out of here because I'm hungry. I want to get somewhere and get something to eat. And you're going to come up here and bug me now about 5 fish and 2 loaves of bread? And so I'm sure they just said, go on, get. And so then they're standing there and they're discussing things and they're talking to each other. It's like, well, how are we going to get out of this? How are we going to get Jesus to let us go? What are we going to do? Blah, blah, blah. And they're going on. But I think that Andrew, because Andrew was the one that told Jesus they found this little boy, I think Andrew all of a sudden, he's like, hey, wait a second, guys. Wait a second, I got the answer. I got it all figured out. He said, where's that little boy? Where'd he go? And he found that little boy and he said, get over here. Come here once. He said, give me that. Give me those 5 fish and them 2 loaves of bread. And so I think he took the 5 loaves of fish and the 2 bread, and he said to the disciples, look, this is all we found. Obviously, we can't feed everybody on 5 fish and 2 loaves of bread. So he said, you know what? This will be the way we can get out of this. And so he goes back to Jesus, and they all go over to Jesus. They say, okay, Lord, look at here. We looked around, this is it. There was this little boy here that we found, and he had 5 fish and 2 loaves of bread, and that's all we found. So that's it. That's all we can find. So, great idea, but yeah, there's not enough here to feed everybody, so I think you need to just send everybody home. Let's call her a day. But I think Jesus was sitting there, and he kind of knew what was going on. And I think he looked over at that little boy, and that little boy was sitting on the front row. And he looked over at that little boy. And in that moment, that little boy was sitting there, man, and I can just see the look on his face. He's just, look at that. Jesus has got the fish. He's got the bread. Well, this is going to be so cool. He's probably telling the people next to him, watch this. Watch what Jesus is going to do. Oh, this is going to be so great. Because you see, all day, he'd been seeing Jesus performing miracles. He'd been seeing Jesus healing people and whatever, and hearing the word. And he was filled with faith. And again, what he saw that day and what he was experiencing was the exact same thing that the disciples were seeing and experiencing. But the disciples, in their adulthood and in their human reasoning, said, this is an impossible situation, and I'm hungry, and, I need something to eat, but not this little boy. He was sitting there that day, and like I said, he brought that because he just knew, oh man, Jesus is a man of miracles. And he loves us. He'll take care of us. And so again, I think Jesus looking over at that little boy, and that little boy, like I said, he's got this look on his face, and he's like, oh, this is going to be so cool. It's going to be so cool. I can't wait. Oh. He's all excited. And Jesus looked over at him. He looked at that little boy's face, and he could just see the excitement in his face. He could see the faith that that little boy had. And so I think he don't even look at the disciples. I can see Jesus just looking at that little boy, and he's got a smile on his face. And he just went, all right, have the people sit down in groups of 50s and 100s. And the disciples were like, what? What do you mean sit down in 50s and 100s? Did you just hear us? 5 fish, 2 loaves of bread, that's it. Really? What do you plan on doing? And Jesus just sitting there looking at that little boy, and that little boy, he's just, oh, you know. And Jesus kept looking at the little boy, and he just said to the disciples, you know what? Don't worry about it. Set the people down in groups of 50s and 100s, and I got it from here. And we all know the story. Had Jesus fed the 5,000. It said he blessed the fish and the bread, and he fed the 5,000. And everybody ate. And at the end of the day, it said they picked up 12 basketfuls of leftovers. And so he gave 1 basket to each one of the disciples. And I think the reason it turned out that way, and he did that, he wanted them disciples to have to, when they left, to tote a basket of leftovers as a reminder to them, and look what I just did today. Look at the miracle that was performed today. Look what faith did today. So the reason I just believe that this is one of the greatest stories of faith in the Bible, when I read this, is because bottom line is, there's no question that Jesus performed the miracle that day. He performed the miracle. But it was the faith of a 10-year-old boy that actually fed those people that day. There's a story in the Bible, in a couple of the Gospels, where Jesus is sitting and people are bringing little kids to him. And the disciples tell the people, they say, get these kids away. Send them away, send them away. Jesus is too busy. He ain't got time, he ain't got time, he ain't got time. And Jesus told the disciples, he said, no, leave them alone. Let the little kids come to me. And then he made this statement to the disciples, and he said, unless you become like one of these little children, you will never either see nor enter the kingdom of heaven. And I believe this is what he was referring to. It's kind of like, as a parent or a grandparent, if you have a little child, do you remember back in the day when they were little and you could set them up on like a chair or the table and you'd say, hey, come on, jump in my arms, come on. And those little kids, that first time, maybe they were a little bit leery and they're like, I'm not so sure, but you're saying, no, it's okay. It's okay. I got you. I'm your dad. I got you. You're fine. And so pretty soon they just, okay, and they make that first jump. And oh man, that was so cool, that was so cool. And then it gets to a point after the second time, it's a little bit easier, and then a little bit easier, a little bit easier. So finally they get to a point where if they're standing on, you could set them on there and say, okay, jump, and they just, boom, they jump. They don't even think about it. It's because they trust their dad. You see, and they sit there, and when you tell them that, as a little child, they don't sit there and go, well, now let me see before I jump. Let's see, has he got sweat on his hands that maybe he could slip and drop me? Or, what's the distance to make sure I got enough behind me that I can get from there to there? Or, what's the trajectory from me to dad so that make sure that I'm going to go in the right direction? No, they don't sit there and think about human reasoning and logic and think about those things. They just, by faith, they just take off and they jump. And it gets, like I said, to a point where they'll do it without even thinking. I've got 2 little granddaughters that, I do that with, and they've gotten to the point where it's almost like they'll just jump, even when I'm not ready. I could be walking by and they'll go, Grandma! Ah, here they come, and you're catching them, But that's because it's the faith of a child. And they'll just jump. They don't think about it. They don't reason it. They don't try to use logic. They just jump. So today, if you're here as a child of God, and if you're suffering or you're having troubles of some kind, you're struggling or going through a situation, maybe it's finances, you're struggling with your finances, or maybe you have health issues and you're struggling with your health and you're looking for a healing. Or maybe you have relationship issues, and maybe you're having trouble in your marriage, or trouble with your kids or your folks or people you work with. Or maybe you're fighting an addiction of some kind today, whether it be drugs or alcohol or pornography or food, whatever. Or maybe you're here today and you're just struggling with despair or anxiety and fear. And there's just something that's holding you back and something that's troubling you. Or if you're here today and you've never made Jesus the Lord of your life, and you've never asked God to come into to be your Lord and Savior and to watch over your life, because maybe you think, you know what, I've done some pretty rotten things in my life, and I just don't know if God could forgive me and accept me or not. Well, if you've done any of those things, if any of those things would concern you today or cover you or anything else, I want you to know this today. Father God is standing there right now, and He's got His arms out, and He's saying, jump, my child. Jump into my arms, and I've got you covered. And God's telling you, don't go by what you see. Don't go by what you feel. Don't go by what other people are telling you. Don't worry about logic or human reasoning. He said, just be like a child, and with just simple faith, jump. Jump today, and I've got you, and I've got you covered. And I'll love you, and I'll take care of you, and I'll get you through anything you're going through. And if you'll do that today, if you'll just let yourself have simple faith like a child and jump into the arms of God, jump into the arms of Jesus, He'll make you into somebody you never thought you could be. He'll do things with your life that you never thought were possible. And He'll take you places that you never thought you could go. And it's all right there. It's all right for all of us today. God is standing there with His arms open, and it's all right there for all of us. And the only question that I guess I can leave you with today is, can you be child enough to receive it? Let's pray.